The Mafia never warned you twice. When that rule was broken, everyone felt it, even those who thought they were untouchable. I learned that on a Tuesday in October, sitting in a restaurant that doesn't exist anymore, listening to a man say 3 words that changed how I understood power. This isn't something I was supposed to talk about, but the people who made that rule are gone now. Most of them, anyway. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was there, close enough to hear things, close enough to understand how silence worked as currency, how a nod could mean more than a contract, how the absence of a phone call could erase a person from a room they'd sat in for 20 years. I wasn't Mafia, women rarely were, not officially, but I was close to it, close enough to see how it actually functioned. And that proximity taught me something most people never learn. The Mafia's real power wasn't violence. It was understanding. Let me start with the rule itself. In every organization that operates outside the law, there are codes. The Mafia had many, but one stood above the others, carved so deep into the culture that even people on the periphery, people like me, understood it without being told. You never spoke about internal business to anyone outside the circle. Not your wife, not your priest, not the woman you loved more than your wife. You carried what you knew to your grave, or you didn't carry it long at all. This wasn't about loyalty in some romantic sense. It was about survival. The structure worked because information stayed contained. The moment it didn't, the entire system risked exposure. One loose word could unravel years of carefully built infrastructure. So the men I knew, the ones who ran things, they didn't talk. They implied, they suggested, they let you draw your own conclusions. And if you were smart, you never asked for confirmation. That rule existed for a reason that most people don't understand. The Mafia wasn't a gang. It wasn't a loose network of criminals doing business. It was a shadow government with its own courts, its own laws, its own form of justice. And like any government, it required order. The violence everyone fixates on, the murders that make headlines, those were failures. They were what happened when the system broke down, when someone violated a code so fundamentally that talking wouldn't fix it. But most of the time, order was maintained quietly. A man who owed money would find his loan suddenly called in early. A business partner who asked too many questions would discover his shipments delayed, his contracts evaporating, his phone calls unreturned. Pressure was applied without a word being spoken about why. You were expected to understand. And if you didn't, someone would eventually explain it to you in a way you wouldn't forget. I watched this happen more times than I can count. I watched men lose everything because they failed to read a room correctly. I watched friendships dissolve over a perceived slight that was never directly addressed. The Mafia operated on implication and reputation. If you had a reputation for being solid, for keeping your mouth shut, for understanding how things worked, you could move through those rooms safely. But the moment your reputation shifted, the moment doubt crept in, you became a problem. And problems got solved. I was 26 when I first entered that world. I didn't seek it out. It found me the way it found a lot of women, through a man. His name was Vincent, though everyone called him Vin. He was older than me by 15 years, and he had the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture when he walked into a room. Not because he was loud or aggressive, because he was still. He didn't need to prove anything. He'd already proven it years before I met him. Vin worked in waste management. That's what he told people. And it was true, technically. He did manage waste contracts for restaurants and businesses across 3 states. But the contracts weren't won through competitive bidding. They were won through relationships, through understandings, through the kind of quiet agreements that kept certain businesses running smoothly and kept certain people very wealthy. I met him at a charity event. I was working as a coordinator for a nonprofit that helped at-risk youth. He was there because his name was on the donor list, the kind of donor list that organizations didn't question because the checks always cleared. We talked for maybe 10 minutes. He asked me what I did. I told him. He asked if the organization needed help with fundraising. I said we always did. He said he'd make a call. 3 days later, we received a donation for $50,000. Anonymous. But I knew. A week after that, he called me. He said he wanted to take me to dinner to discuss future opportunities for partnership. I said yes. I told myself it was for the organization. But I knew, even then, that I was lying to myself. Dinner was at a place in the North End, a restaurant with no sign outside, the kind of place where you needed to know it existed to find it. Inside, it was warm and dark, candles on every table, the smell of garlic and wine and bread baked that afternoon. We were seated immediately, no reservation, at a table in the back corner. The owner came over personally, kissed Vin on both cheeks, called him compare, brought us wine we didn't order. We talked about everything except what he actually did. He asked about my family. I told him my father had been a union organizer, that he died when I was 19. Vin nodded slowly. A good man, then. He tried to be. Trying's enough. Most people don't even do that. He asked if my father had taught me anything. I said he taught me that power protects itself, that the only way to help people was to understand the systems they were trapped in. Vin smiled. Your father was smart. That night, he didn't touch me. He didn't ask me back to his place. He paid the check, walked me to my car, and told me he'd like to see me again. I said okay. He said good. Then he waited until I started my car and drove away before he got into his own. That was how it started. Slowly, carefully, with respect. Over the next 6 months, I saw Vin 2 or 3 times a week. Dinners, mostly, sometimes a drive along the coast. Once, a weekend trip to a lake house upstate where we spent 2 days reading and cooking and talking about things that didn't matter. He never pushed, never asked for more than I was willing to give. And gradually, I started to trust him. It was during that time that I began to understand the world he moved through. He never explained it directly, but I was observant. I noticed the way certain men greeted him. I noticed the phone calls he took in another room. I noticed that when he said he'd handle something, it got handled, no follow-up needed. One night, we were having dinner at his apartment. He cooked, something I hadn't expected. Pasta with clams, simple and perfect. We were eating when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, sighed, and stood up. I need to take this. 2 minutes. He stepped into the hallway. I heard his voice, low and steady. No, that's not what we agreed. I don't care what he thinks he heard. Tell him if he wants to renegotiate, he does it with me, not with you. No. Tomorrow, 6 o'clock, he knows where. He came back, sat down, picked up his fork. Everything okay? I asked. It will be. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. That was the first time I consciously practiced the silence that would define the next 3 years of my life. As I became more involved with Vin, I was gradually introduced to the others. Not formally. There were no ceremonies, no official meetings. But I started appearing at places where they gathered. Social clubs that looked like ordinary storefronts but hummed with quiet authority. Restaurants where the backroom was always reserved. Weddings, baptisms, funerals. I learned quickly that the Mafia's real life happened at these events, not in dark alleys or smoky backrooms. Business was conducted over espresso and cannoli. Disputes were settled while someone's daughter danced at her wedding. The violence everyone imagines was rare. What happened far more often was conversation, assessment, the slow building of trust or the careful withdrawal of it. The women in that world occupied a specific space. We were present but not included. We sat at the tables, we laughed at the jokes, we kissed cheeks and exchanged recipes and complimented each other's clothes. But we also understood that certain conversations stopped when we approached, that certain rooms were not for us, that our role was to maintain the social fabric while the men conducted their actual business. But we saw things, we heard things, and if you were paying attention, you understood more than the men realized. I met Teresa at a baptism. She was married to a man named Carlo, who worked with Vin in waste management, which meant they were partners in the truest sense. Teresa was 43, elegant, always perfectly dressed, always perfectly composed. She had 3 children, all sons, all being groomed for legitimate careers. Doctor, lawyer, businessman. She told me this while we stood near the dessert table. watching our men talk in the corner. You seem smart, she said. Thank you. So let me give you some advice. Whatever you think you know, keep it to yourself. Whatever you see, forget it by morning. And whatever you hear, you didn't. I understand. Do you? She looked at me directly. Because a lot of girls think they do. Then something happens, and they panic. They talk to a friend. They call their mother. They go to the police thinking they'll be protected. She paused. They're wrong. I won't talk. Good. She smiled. Then you'll be fine. Teresa became something like a mentor to me, though neither of us would have used that word. She taught me how to navigate the social structures, how to read the room, how to know when to leave a conversation and when to stay silent in one. She taught me that the Mafia wasn't just about the men. It was about the families, the networks, the women who held everything together while pretending they knew nothing. One afternoon, we had coffee at her house. Her kitchen was immaculate, all marble and stainless steel, the kind of kitchen that appeared in magazines. She made espresso and set out biscotti she'd baked that morning. Can I ask you something? I said. You can ask. I might not answer. How long have you been married to Carlo? 24 years. Do you love him? She looked at me for a long moment. Love's complicated. I respect him. I trust him to take care of us. I trust him to be smart. That's more than most women get. But do you love him? I did once. Now I love what we built together. Is that the same thing? I don't know. She sipped her espresso. Why? Are you in love with Vin? I think so. Does he know? I haven't told him. Don't. Let him say it first. Men like that, they need to be the ones who decide. If you push, he'll pull away. That seems unfair. It is. But fair doesn't matter. What matters is understanding how things work. I took her advice. 3 weeks later, Vin told me he loved me. We were in his car, parked outside my apartment, rain drumming on the roof. He said it quietly, almost like he wasn't sure he should. I love you. You know that, right? I know. I need you to understand what that means. For me, in my life, I understand. Do you? Because once you're in, you're in. There's no casual with this. There's no walking away clean. I'm not trying to walk away. He looked at me. Good, because I'd never let you go anyway. It should have scared me. Maybe it did, a little. But mostly, I felt chosen. Protected, like I'd been admitted into something rare and valuable. I didn't yet understand that protection and imprisonment could look identical from the inside. For 2 years, things were stable. I moved into Vin's apartment. I quit my job at the nonprofit, though he made sure they received anonymous donations that kept them running. I had no official role in his life, no title, no clear purpose. But I was there. I listened. I learned. I became part of the background in rooms where decisions were made. I learned that the Mafia operated like a business, because that's what it was. There were revenue streams, construction, garbage collection, trucking, unions, restaurants, importing, loan sharking. There were expenses, payoffs to police and politicians, legal fees, payments to families of men who were incarcerated. There were investments, legitimate businesses that cleaned money, real estate that appreciated, opportunities that opened doors. And there were rules, so many rules. You didn't steal from your own people. You didn't lie to your superiors. You didn't disrespect someone's wife. You didn't conduct business in certain public places. You didn't testify, no matter what they offered you. You didn't talk to law enforcement, even to say hello. You honored your debts. You kept your word. You accepted decisions from above, even when you disagreed. The men I knew followed these rules religiously, not because they were moral, but because the system only worked if everyone adhered to the structure. The Mafia was fragile in a way most people didn't realize. It depended entirely on mutual trust within a community of people who had every reason to betray each other. So the rules weren't guidelines. They were the foundation, and when someone broke a rule, everyone knew. It happened on a Thursday in March. I was with Teresa at a market in the North End, buying ingredients for dinner. She was teaching me how to pick the right tomatoes, how to smell basil to tell if it was fresh. We were laughing about something, I don't remember what, when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Answered. Yes, when? Does Carlo know? Okay, I'll see you tonight. She hung up. Her face hadn't changed, but her energy had. She continued shopping, but there was a tension now, a precision to her movements. Everything okay? I asked. Fine. We finished shopping. She drove me home. Before I got out of the car, she touched my arm. Don't ask Vin about anything tonight. If he wants to talk, let him. Otherwise, just be normal. What happened? Someone made a mistake. It'll get handled. How bad? She looked at me. Bad enough. That night, Vin came home late. I'd made dinner and kept it warm. He barely ate. He sat at the table, staring at his plate, his mind clearly elsewhere. Long day? I asked. Yeah. You want to talk about it? No. I cleared the plates, made coffee, brought it to him. He took the cup but didn't drink. Someone I know did something stupid, he said finally. Now it's a mess. Can it be fixed? Maybe. Depends on him. What did he do? Vin looked at me. You don't need to know that. Okay. He stood up, kissed the top of my head. I might need to go out later. Don't wait up. Be careful. Always. He left around midnight. I heard his car start, the sound fading down the street. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off, waiting. He came back just before dawn. He didn't say anything, just went to the bedroom and closed the door. Over the next week, I noticed changes. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. Phone calls Vin took outside. Attention at dinners that hadn't been there before. Teresa was quieter than usual. The other women too. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it. I learned what had happened piece by piece, the way you always learned things in that world. Not from direct explanation, but from fragments of overheard conversations, from things people didn't say, from the conspicuous absence of someone who used to be present. His name was Michael. Everyone called him Mikey. He was young, maybe 30, eager to prove himself. He worked under a man named Sal, running a bookmaking operation that brought in decent money. Mikey had a problem, though. He liked to talk. He liked to be seen as important, as someone who knew things. And one night, drunk at a bar, trying to impress a woman he'd just met, he said too much. He mentioned names. He described how money moved. He talked about protection payments and who was on the take. The woman he was talking to seemed interested. She asked questions. He answered them, feeling powerful, feeling like a man who mattered. She was an FBI informant. She'd been cultivating him for 3 months. When the Mafia found out, there was no immediate violence. That's not how it worked. First, there were conversations. Mikey was brought in, asked to explain. He admitted what he'd done. He said he didn't know, that he thought she was just a girl, that he never meant any harm. He begged for another chance. The decision went up the chain. Discussions happened in rooms I never saw. Arguments were made for and against. Mikey's father was respected, had been with the organization for 40 years. That counted for something, but the rule he'd broken was fundamental. And in an organization built on silence, talking to a federal informant was unforgivable. I was at Vin's apartment when he got the call about the decision. He listened for several minutes without speaking. Understood. Yeah, I'll make sure. Okay. He hung up, sat down heavily on the couch. They're giving him a pass, he said, out of respect for his father. But he's out. No business, no contact, no family events. He's erased. What does that mean for him? It means he gets to live. But he's got no protection anymore. No income, no network. He's on his own. That's it? They're just cutting him off? That's not just anything. You don't understand what it means to be outside. Every business he tries to start, someone will make sure it fails. Every job he applies for, a call gets made. Every friend he has, they'll stop returning his messages. He's alive, but he's dead in every way that matters. That seems cruel. Vin looked at me. He talked to the feds. What did he think would happen? Mikey disappeared from the social clubs, from the restaurants, from the gatherings. His name stopped being mentioned. It was like he'd never existed. I saw his father once, at a funeral a few months later. He looked 10 years older. When someone expressed condolences about his son, he said, "I don't have a son," and he walked away. That was when I truly understood the power of the Mafia's silence. It wasn't just about not talking to outsiders. It was about the ability to erase someone from collective memory, to enforce absence so completely that a man could be standing in a room and be invisible. And I understood something else. I was being trusted with this knowledge. By being present, by hearing these things, I was being tested. Could I keep silent? Could I be trusted? I never asked Vin about Mikey again. I never mentioned it to anyone. I proved I could carry what I knew. But the incident changed something. The atmosphere became more cautious. The men were more careful about who was in the room when certain topics came up. And I noticed that I was increasingly excluded from spaces I'd previously been allowed in. Teresa explained it to me one afternoon. We were walking through a park, her suggestion, somewhere we couldn't be overheard. "They're scared," she said. "When something like Mikey happens, everyone gets paranoid. They start wondering who else might talk. Who else might be a risk. They think I'm a risk. They think everyone's a risk right now. It's not personal. It's just how things work after a violation. How long will it last? Until they feel secure again. Could be months. Could be longer. And what do I do in the meantime? Keep your head down. Don't ask questions. Don't appear too interested. Just be Vin's girlfriend. That's all you need to be." I tried to follow her advice. But the distance bothered me. I'd grown accustomed to feeling like I understood what was happening, to feeling included in some small way. Now I was back on the outside, and it reminded me how precarious my position actually was. One night, Vin and I were having dinner at home. I'd cooked, something I was getting better at. We were halfway through the meal when I decided to ask something I'd been wondering about. "Do you ever worry about ending up like Mikey?" He put down his fork. "Why would you ask me that?" "I don't know. I've just been thinking about how quickly everything changed for him. I'm not Mikey, I know, but the rule he broke, isn't that something that could happen to anyone? A moment of bad judgment. And it's not a moment, it's a choice. Mikey chose to run his mouth. He chose to try to impress some girl. He chose to break the most important rule we have. That's not bad judgment, that's stupidity. But people make mistakes. Not that mistake, not if they're serious." He looked at me carefully. "Why are you really asking this?" "I guess I'm trying to understand how you live with it. The pressure, the constant awareness that one wrong move could cost you everything." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You don't think about it that way. You think about it like any other job. You have responsibilities. You meet them. You have rules. You follow them. Most people go their whole lives and nothing bad happens because they're smart and they're careful. Mikey wasn't careful, so he paid for it. And you're always careful? I'm here, aren't I?" The conversation ended there, but it sat with me. I started to notice how much of Vin's life was calculated, how every decision was filtered through an awareness of risk. He never drank more than one glass of wine. He never said anything on the phone that could be used against him. He never fully trusted anyone, including me. And I started to wonder what it cost him, living that way. What it did to a person's soul to never relax, to always be performing, to treat every relationship as a potential liability. A few months later, in the summer, something happened that brought all of this into sharp focus. We were at a wedding. Big, expensive, 300 people. The bride was the daughter of a man named Paulie, who ran labor unions in the construction industry. Vin had known him for 20 years. We sat at a table near the front with Teresa and Carlo and two other couples I'd met before. The wedding was beautiful, traditional. The bride cried during the vows. Her father cried too. There was a moment, watching them, when I felt something close to hope. Maybe there was room for genuine emotion in this world. Maybe it wasn't all calculation. During dinner, Vin excused himself. "Be right back." He was gone for almost 20 minutes. When he returned, his face was composed, but I could see tension in his shoulders. Teresa noticed too. She caught my eye, gave a tiny shake of her head. "Don't ask." The reception continued. Dancing, cake, speeches. Around 11, we left. In the car, Vin was silent. Nice wedding, I said. Yeah, Polly seemed happy. He did. Is something wrong? He glanced at me. I had a conversation I didn't want to have. About what? Business. Bad business? Potentially. He didn't elaborate. I didn't push. The next morning, he left early. Didn't say where he was going. I spent the day reading, cleaning, trying not to worry. He came back that evening, looking exhausted. Everything okay? I asked. It will be. That phrase again. It will be. Not it is. Will be. Future tense. Conditional. Over the next week, Vin had several meetings. Late nights. Phone calls he took in another room. I felt the familiar exclusion. But this time it was sharper. Something was happening, and I wasn't being told what. Teresa called me on a Friday afternoon. Can you meet me? Same place as before. I met her at the park. She was already there, sitting on a bench, sunglasses on even though it was overcast. There's a problem, she said as soon as I sat down. I can't tell you details. But you need to know that things might get complicated. How complicated? The kind where you might need to answer questions. What kind of questions? From people you don't want to talk to. My stomach dropped. You mean law enforcement? Maybe. I don't know yet. But if they come to you, you say nothing. Not without a lawyer. You understand? What happened? Someone's talking. Not from inside. Someone adjacent. And it's creating exposure for a lot of people, including Vin. Who's talking? I can't tell you that. Just be prepared. That conversation terrified me in a way nothing else had. Until that moment, law enforcement had been abstract. A distant threat that applied to other people. Now it was real. Now it was aimed at the man I loved. I went home and waited for Vin. When he arrived, I told him about my conversation with Teresa. He nodded slowly. She's being careful. Smart. Is it true? Is someone talking? Yeah. Who? A contractor. Guy who did work for a few different people. He got jammed up on a fraud charge, and now he's cooperating. What does he know? Enough to be a problem. Are you in danger? Not if I'm smart. Vin, I need to know what's happening. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, the less you know, the safer you are. If anyone asks you questions, you don't know anything. You're just my girlfriend. We go to dinners, we go to weddings, that's it. You don't know about business. You don't know about money. You don't know about anything. Can you do that? Yes, I need you to be sure. I'm sure. He pulled me close. It's going to be okay. I promise. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. 3 weeks later, federal agents showed up at the apartment. 6 in the morning, pounding on the door. Vin answered in his boxer shorts, calm despite the situation. They had a search warrant. They went through everything. Drawers, closets, files, computers. They were there for 4 hours. They asked Vin questions. He said nothing except, talk to my lawyer. They asked me questions too. Was I aware of any illegal activity? Had I ever witnessed discussions about criminal behavior? Did I know the names of certain individuals? I said no to everything. I said I was just his girlfriend. I said I didn't know anything about his business. They didn't believe me. I could see it in their faces. But they couldn't prove otherwise. When they finally left, Vin sat on the couch and stared at the wall. They didn't find anything, he said. Because there's nothing here to find. I'm not stupid. What happens now? We wait. They'll try to pressure me. They'll try to flip me. But I've got a good lawyer, and I've been careful. Unless that contractor has more than I think he has, they've got nothing solid. And if he does, then it gets complicated. Over the next few months, the investigation intensified. Subpoenas, grand jury testimonies, agents showing up at businesses, asking questions, making their presence known. The Mafia's response was predictable, total silence. Nobody talked, nobody cooperated, the wall held, but the pressure changed everything. Social events became rare, people were cautious about being seen together. Phone calls were brief and vague. The world I'd become accustomed to contracted, became smaller, more insular. Vin was indicted in December. Racketeering, fraud, conspiracy. The charges were broad, built on the testimony of the contractor and financial records they'd subpoenaed. His lawyer said it was beatable, that the evidence was circumstantial. But everyone knew the government wouldn't have brought charges unless they thought they could win. The trial was set for the following summer. In the meantime, Vin was out on bail, trying to maintain normalcy while preparing for the possibility of prison. I stayed with him through all of it, not because I was noble or loyal in some abstract sense, because I loved him, and because leaving would have been its own kind of betrayal, one I couldn't live with. But the relationship changed. The lightness we'd once had was gone. Everything was heavy now, weighted with awareness of what was coming. We still had dinners, still slept in the same bed, still said we loved each other, but there was a distance between us, a space created by all the things we couldn't say. One night, lying in the dark, he asked me, if this goes bad, if I end up inside, what will you do? Wait for you. That could be years. I know. You'd really do that? Yes. He was quiet. Then, you shouldn't. You should move on. Find someone who can give you a real life. You are my real life. I'm a guy going to prison. You're the man I love. He pulled me closer. Neither of us slept that night. The trial started in July. It lasted 6 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with Teresa and the other wives and girlfriends. We didn't speak to each other during the proceedings. We just sat, a silent chorus of women watching the men we loved face judgment. The prosecutor painted Vin as a criminal, a man who'd spent years exploiting honest workers and corrupting legitimate businesses. They brought in witnesses. They showed documents. They built their case methodically. Vin's lawyer fought back. He attacked the credibility of the contractor. He challenged the financial evidence. He argued that Vin was a businessman, nothing more, that the government was trying to criminalize normal business practices because they couldn't prove actual crimes. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Guilty, on most counts. The sentencing hearing was 4 weeks later. The judge gave him 8 years. When they led him away, he looked back at me once. He didn't smile, he didn't cry, he just looked at me, and in that look was everything we'd never said to each other. I kept my promise. I waited. I visited him once a month, driving 4 hours to a federal prison in Pennsylvania. We sat across from each other in a visiting room full of other couples having similar conversations, trying to maintain connection through glass and guards and time. During one visit, maybe a year in, he said something that stayed with me. You know what the hardest part is? It's not the confinement. It's not the food or the noise or the violence. It's the silence. In here, you can't talk about anything that matters. You can't trust anyone. You can't let your guard down. It's like being Mafia, except without any of the benefits. Just the paranoia. Is it different from outside? He laughed. A sad sound. No, that's the thing. It's exactly the same. I've been in prison my whole life. I just didn't realize it until now. We divorced after 3 years. Not because I stopped loving him. Because he asked me to. He said he didn't want me wasting my life waiting for a man who might not be the same person when he got out. I agreed, even though it hurt. Because by then, I understood what he'd been trying to tell me from the beginning. The Mafia doesn't just operate outside the law. It operates outside normal life. It requires you to sacrifice the things that make life meaningful in exchange for the illusion of power. And once you're in, even when you're out, you're never really free. Vin was released after serving 6 years. I heard about it through Teresa, who I still spoke to occasionally. He moved to Arizona, started a small business doing something with landscaping. Something quiet, something that wouldn't attract attention. He called me once, a few months after his release. We talked for almost an hour. About nothing important. About the weather and the places we'd been and the people we used to know. At the end of the call, he said, "I'm glad you moved on. You deserve a good life. So do you." Yeah, maybe. I'm working on it. That was 7 years ago. I haven't heard from him since. The Mafia that I knew, the world I lived adjacent to for those years, it's mostly gone now. Some of the men died. Some went to prison. Some cooperated with the government and entered witness protection. The younger generation, the sons who were supposed to carry on the tradition, most of them chose legitimate paths. They became doctors and lawyers and businessmen, not the kind their fathers were, but real ones. The organizations still exist, I'm sure. But they're smaller now, more careful, more corporate. The old rules still apply in some circles. But the world has changed. The Mafia doesn't have the same power it once did. Too much surveillance. Too much cooperation from people who used to stay silent. Too many ways to get caught. What I learned from those years is something I think about often. The Mafia survived for so long because it understood something fundamental about human nature. People will accept almost anything if they feel protected. They'll overlook violence, corruption, exploitation, as long as they believe the system is keeping them safe. And the system worked, for a while. It provided jobs, settled disputes, maintained order in neighborhoods where the government had failed. But it required silence. It required everyone to look the way, to not ask questions, to accept that some things were best left unknown. That silence protected a lot of people, but it also trapped them. The women I knew, women like Teresa, they spent their whole lives knowing things they could never speak about. They raised children in that silence. They attended funerals for men who died for reasons that were never explained. They smiled and cooked and maintained appearances while carrying the weight of everything they understood but couldn't acknowledge. And the men, they carried it too. Vin once told me, during one of those prison visits, that the worst part wasn't what he'd done. It was what he couldn't undo. The relationships he'd destroyed by maintaining distance. The love he'd refused to fully give because vulnerability was dangerous. The version of himself he'd buried so deep that he wasn't sure it still existed. I don't know who I am without the rules, he said. I've been following them so long, I don't know what I actually believe anymore. What I actually want. I asked him what he would do differently if he could go back. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, I'd leave. Early, before I was in too deep. I'd get out when it was still a choice. Why didn't you? Because it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like family, like loyalty, like the only world that made sense. He paused, and by the time I realized it was a prison, I'd already built the walls too high to climb. That's what people don't understand about the Mafia. It's not just about crime. It's about belonging. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself, something with history and tradition and meaning. For men who grew up in neighborhoods where opportunities were limited, where the system had failed them, the Mafia offered identity, purpose, respect. But the cost was autonomy. The cost was freedom. The cost was the ability to make choices based on what you wanted rather than what the organization needed. I think about the younger version of myself sometimes. The woman who walked into that charity event and met a man who seemed powerful and confident and in control. I think about how impressed I was by the way doors opened for him, by the way people treated him with deference, by the illusion of mastery he projected. I didn't see the cage he was in. I didn't understand that every gesture of respect was also a reminder of obligation. Every favor granted created a debt. Every show of power required constant maintenance. The Mafia operates on a principle that seems simple: loyalty in exchange for protection. But what it actually trades is freedom for the illusion of security. And once you accept that trade, once you step inside that world, leaving becomes almost impossible. Not because they'll kill you, though sometimes that happens, but because you've built your entire identity around belonging to something that doesn't exist outside its own boundaries. Your friends are there, your reputation is there, your sense of worth is there. Who are you without it? That's what happened to Mikey. When they cut him off, they didn't just take away his income. They took away his identity. He wasn't Michael anymore. He wasn't anyone, just a ghost of the person he used to be, wandering through a world that no longer recognized him. I saw him once, years after he'd been erased. I was in a supermarket, buying groceries, living the ordinary life I'd built after everything fell apart. And there he was, in the produce section, looking at tomatoes. He'd aged badly. His face was gray, his shoulders slumped. He wore cheap clothes, the kind that come from discount stores. He looked like he'd been hollowed out. I almost said something, almost went over and asked how he was. offered some kind of connection to the past. But then I remembered the rules. Even years later, even after everything, the rules still applied. You didn't acknowledge the erased. You didn't offer them recognition. Because doing so was its own kind of violation. So I turned away, finished my shopping, left, and I've carried the guilt of that moment ever since. Not because I owed Mikey anything, but because in that moment, I chose the rules over my own humanity. I chose the system over compassion. I chose to be complicit in his erasure. That's what the Mafia does. It doesn't just control your actions. It controls your instincts. It rewires you until maintaining the code feels more important than maintaining your soul. After Vin and I divorced, I spent years trying to unlearn that conditioning. Trying to remember how to trust my own judgment instead of deferring to invisible hierarchies. Trying to speak freely instead of filtering everything through awareness of who might be listening. It was harder than I expected. The silence I'd practiced had become habitual. I found myself stopping mid-sentence, editing thoughts, calculating risk before I spoke. Even in conversations that had no stakes, with people who had no connection to that world, I still operated like I was being watched. Teresa died 4 years ago. Cancer. I went to her funeral. It was huge, hundreds of people, the same kind of gathering I'd attended so many times before. But it felt different, emptier, like we were all performing a ritual we no longer fully believed in. Carlo gave the eulogy. He talked about what a good wife she'd been, what a good mother. He talked about her strength, her grace, her dedication to family. He cried, real tears, genuine grief. But he didn't talk about who she actually was. The sharp intelligence, the dark humor, the way she navigated impossible situations with precision and care, the way she'd mentored younger women like me, teaching us how to survive in a world that saw us as decorative rather than essential. After the service, I approached him to offer condolences. She loved you, I said. He nodded. I know. I loved her too. Did you tell her that? Near the end? He looked at me, confused. Of course. I mean really tell her. Everything you felt. Everything you couldn't say before. He was quiet. Then, I said what I could. But not everything. No, not everything. He walked away. And I understood that even in death, even at the very end, the rules had held. There were things Carlo felt that he'd never expressed. Things Teresa knew but had never asked him to confirm. They'd spent 24 years together, raised 3 sons, built a life. And they'd done it all while maintaining the careful distance the Mafia required. That's the saddest part, I think. Not the violence, not the prison sentences, not even the betrayals. It's the love that was never fully expressed. The intimacy that was never fully achieved. The versions of themselves they never got to be because being those versions would have been too dangerous. I'm 41 now. I live alone in a city 3 states away from where all of this happened. I work as a consultant for nonprofits, helping them with fundraising and organizational development. It's good work, meaningful work, work that lets me sleep at night. Sometimes people ask me if I was ever married. I tell them I was, briefly, a long time ago. They ask what happened. I say we grew apart. They accept this because it's a common story, one that doesn't require deeper explanation. I don't tell them about Vin. I don't tell them about the world I lived in for those years. I don't tell them about Teresa or Carlo or Mikey or any of the others. Because even now, even after all this time, I'm still keeping the silence. Not out of fear. The Mafia I knew doesn't exist anymore. And even if it did, I've been gone too long to matter. I keep silent because I don't know how to translate that experience into language people would understand. How do you explain that you loved a man who was genuinely kind to you but also part of a system that destroyed lives? How do you explain that you witnessed criminal activity but also saw real community, real loyalty, real care? The truth is too complicated for the narratives people want. They want clear villains and innocent victims. They want the Mafia to be purely evil or secretly noble. They can't hold the reality that it was both and neither, that it was a human system with human flaws, capable of both protection and destruction. So I keep the silence. Not the enforced silence of those years, but a chosen silence. The silence of someone who knows that some stories can't be told without being misunderstood. But I think about it every day. I think about the cost of the choices I made, the person I became in that world, and the person I had to become to leave it. I think about whether I'm free now or just in a different kind of cage, one I built myself from guilt and memory and unresolved grief. I think about Vin in Arizona, tending gardens, trying to build something that doesn't require him to be anyone other than who he is. I hope he's found some kind of peace. I hope he's learned how to live without the rules. But I doubt it, because the rules aren't just external. They're internal. They're part of how you see the world, how you process risk, how you relate to other people. You can leave the Mafia, but the Mafia doesn't leave you. There's a story Teresa told me once, during one of our afternoon coffees. She said when she was young, maybe 22, before she married Carlo, she'd had a chance to leave. A man she'd been seeing, a civilian, someone outside that world, had asked her to move with him to California. He had a job offer, a fresh start, a future that had nothing to do with the life she'd grown up in. She said she almost went. She packed a bag. She wrote a letter to her parents. She stood in her bedroom holding everything she'd need to start over. And then she unpacked, threw away the letter, called the man and told him she couldn't do it. Why not? I asked. She looked at me with something like sadness. Because I realized I'd rather be in a cage I understood than free in a world I didn't. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I do now. Freedom is terrifying. It requires you to make choices without the guidance of clear rules. It requires you to trust your own judgment, to risk being wrong, to accept responsibility for outcomes you can't control. For people who've spent their lives in structured systems, that kind of freedom feels like chaos. The Mafia offered structure, clear hierarchies, defined roles, predictable consequences. You knew where you stood. You knew what was expected. You knew how to navigate the world you were in. Leaving meant giving up that certainty. It meant stepping into ambiguity, into a world where the rules were unclear and the consequences unpredictable. It meant becoming responsible for your own life in a way you'd never had to be before. And for a lot of people, that was a trade they weren't willing to make. I made the trade, but I'm still paying for it. Still figuring out how to be a person who makes choices based on what I want rather than what's safe. Still learning to trust people without calculating their potential to betray me. Still trying to speak without filtering every word through awareness of how it might be used against me. Some days I wonder if I'll ever fully deprogram. If I'll ever stop seeing the world through the lens of risk and loyalty and silence. If I'll ever just be a person instead of a former insider to a world that doesn't exist anymore. Other days, I think the point isn't to forget. It's to integrate, to carry what I learned without letting it define me. To use the understanding I gained to navigate the world more carefully, more thoughtfully, with more awareness of how systems work and what they cost. Because that's the thing about the Mafia that no one talks about. It's not just a criminal organization. It's a system, and systems exist everywhere, in corporations, in governments, in social groups, in families. Wherever there are power dynamics, wherever there are rules that everyone follows but no one acknowledges, wherever there's silence protecting something that wouldn't survive scrutiny, there's a version of what I experienced. The Mafia just made it explicit, made it visible, made it impossible to deny. But the dynamics, the psychology, the trade-offs, they're universal. We all navigate systems that demand our silence. We all make choices about what we're willing to overlook in exchange for belonging. We all participate in structures that harm people while telling ourselves it's necessary, or justified, or just the way things are. The Mafia taught me to see that. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Last month, I was having dinner with a friend, someone I met years after I left that world. Someone who knows nothing about my history. She was telling me about her job, about how her company was engaging in practices she found ethically questionable but that everyone else seemed fine with. Should I say something? She asked. Or should I just keep my head down? I thought about all the times I'd kept my head down. All the things I'd witnessed and said nothing about. All the silence I'd maintained in service of a system I knew was wrong. What do you think will happen if you speak up? I asked. I'll probably lose my job. Maybe get blacklisted in the industry. And if you stay silent? I keep my job, my income, my career trajectory, but I hate myself a little more every day. I looked at her. Then you already know the answer. Do I? You're asking for permission to do what you know is right. But no one can give you that permission except yourself. You have to decide what you can live with. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That's not very reassuring." No, but it's true. I don't know what she decided. We haven't talked about it since. But I think about that conversation often. About how we're all constantly making these calculations, weighing our integrity against our security, trying to find the point where we can live with ourselves while still surviving in systems that demand our complicity. There's no easy answer. There's no rule that tells you when to speak and when to stay silent, when to resist and when to comply, when to leave and when to stay. The Mafia had rules for everything. But those rules were designed to protect the system, not the people in it. They created order at the cost of autonomy. They maintained structure at the cost of humanity. And that's the final lesson, I think. The most important one. Rules can guide you. Systems can support you. Structure can give you security. But in the end, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. You have to choose between what's safe and what's right. And you have to live with whatever you choose. I chose safety for years. I chose silence. I chose to be complicit in a system I knew was corrupt because leaving felt impossible. And then one day, it didn't. One day, I looked at my life and realized I'd traded everything meaningful for the illusion of security. I'd given up my voice, my autonomy, my sense of self, in exchange for protection I didn't actually need. So I left, not dramatically, not in a moment of crisis. Just quietly, gradually, over months of small decisions that added up to a different life. And it was hard. It was terrifying. It was lonely, but it was mine. That's what freedom actually means, I think. Not the absence of consequences. Not the ability to do whatever you want without cost. But the ownership of your choices. The responsibility for your life. The knowledge that whatever happens, you decided it. The Mafia never gave me that. It gave me belonging and identity and protection. But it never gave me myself. I had to take that back. I had to reclaim it piece by piece, day by day, choice by choice. And I'm still doing it. Still figuring out who I am when I'm not performing a role. When I'm not maintaining appearances, when I'm not filtering everything through awareness of invisible rules. It's a slow process. Maybe it's a lifelong one. But it's worth it. I'm worth it. That's what I would tell the younger version of myself, the woman who walked into that charity event looking for meaning, looking for connection, looking for a world that made sense. I'd tell her that the world will never make sense. That meaning comes from within, not from belonging to something external. That connection requires vulnerability, not protection. I'd tell her that power always costs more than it promises. That silence is a form of violence. That the cage you build for safety becomes the prison you can't escape. I'd tell her to trust herself. To speak. To leave before she's in too deep. But I don't know if she would listen. Because when you're young and alone and looking for somewhere to belong, the Mafia's promise is seductive. It offers certainty in an uncertain world. It offers identity in a culture that makes you feel invisible. It offers protection in an environment that feels hostile. And by the time you realize what you've traded for that protection, you've already forgotten what it felt like to be free. So instead of telling her what to do, I'd just hold her. I'd let her know that whatever she chooses, whatever she survives, she'll be okay eventually. It might take years, it might cost everything, but she'll be okay, because that's the truth the Mafia never tells you. You're stronger than the system. You're more resilient than the rules. You're more complete than the identity they give you. You just have to believe it. And then you have to prove it. Every single day, for the rest of your life. The Mafia's gone now, most of it, anyway. But the silence remains, in the people who survived it, in the families who carry it forward. In the neighborhoods that still remember what it meant to live under those rules. And in me, I carry it still, not as obligation anymore, but as knowledge, as understanding, as a reminder of what happens when we trade our voices for safety, our autonomy for belonging, our truth for acceptance. I carry it as a warning, and as a witness, because someone has to remember. Someone has to tell the story, even if it's just to themselves, even if it's just in the quiet moments alone when no one else is listening. Someone has to say, this happened. This was real. These choices had consequences. This silence had costs. Someone has to break the rule, even if it's just once, even if it's just now, even if no one's listening anymore. The Mafia never warned you twice, but they never told you the whole truth either. They never told you that the second warning was silence itself. The absence of sound, the space where your voice used to be. They never told you that you could survive that silence. But you can. I did. And if you're listening to this, if you recognize something in this story, if you've lived in your own version of this cage, you can too. You just have to choose it. Every day, until the silence becomes yours instead of theirs. Until you own it instead of it owning you. Until you remember what your voice sounds like. And then you speak.